These burger buns are soft, fluffy, easy to make, don't need a stand mixer, and don't rely on letting butter warm up to room temperature before you get making. I'm Nick, this is Baked Bread Instead, and today we're going to talk about making burger buns using single cream. Pause now if you need the ingredients. What you'll notice is there aren't that many. This is super straightforward and it really strips the difficulty out of creating an enriched dough for making brioche style buns. So, measure out your cream. We're going to use 2/3 cream to 1/3 water in our liquid for this recipe. That's, in this case, 200 millilitres of cream to 100 millilitres of warm water. I always prefer to weigh everything out using a scale rather than using measuring jugs. For me, it's easier to understand. I don't need to worry about things varying from jug to jug. And so long as I always use the same scale, everything's going to be out by roughly the same amount. Combine your yeast with your warm water, measured carefully so that we're not using too much. We're going to move it off to one side and let it come to life in that warm water while we measure our dry ingredients. Now, if I was to make this recipe again, I would use all-purpose flour. You can maybe see here that I'm using a strong bread flour, and I feel that the buns that came out of this, while they were really shapely, well risen, they were denser than the loaf I had made previously using a plain flour. My tip to you, go with something lower protein on this. Okay, we can see that our yeast is coming to life, there's some bubbling in action, so we're ready to start pulling things together. On top of your flour, add the salt to this recipe. It's a 2% salt mix. I use that for most of my bread. So that's 10 grams of salt into the 500 grams of flour. Give it a good mix. I do this because when we're pouring our yeast on top, I don't want it to land on straight salt. I've seen some videos that suggest that perhaps it's not as big a deal, but salt is bad for yeast, so diluting it through the flour before we start combining it with the yeast is probably for the best. Make a well in the middle of your flour large enough to hold both the warmed cream and the yeasted water. We're going to pour that into there and start stirring things together. I start by pouring the yeast in and combining that a little bit so that it gets a chance to get access to flour before I pour in the fats. So you'll see me doing that now. If you've followed along with my Swedish bun recipe recently, you'll know that it doesn't really prevent a rise, but better to be safe than sorry. Pour your cream mixture on top of that yeast paste and combine the rest of your ingredients together. At this stage, we've made our dough. It's as simple as that. If this were a traditional brioche recipe, we would be slowly adding butter to a stand mixer again and again and again, just to the point where it reaches a sort of saturation level. And sure, you get a beautiful, buttery, rich result doing it that way. But these buns are quick, and when you need to get burgers put out in front of people in a hurry, I would go this method every single time because the result is still outstanding. Kneading in the bowl just till it's at a point where it can be handled. If you're having a hard time getting the very dregs of the flour to combine with your dough in the bowl, just tip them out on the table. We'll work them in as we need. This is a firm, enriched dough, and that means we don't need to add any additional flour. It's really quite easy to handle. Just another quick tip here. You'll see that I bring doughs together very quickly in my videos. That's achieved by the magic of editing. I will still give my doughs maybe 10 minutes of kneading if I'm kneading by hand until they're properly mixed, they're smooth and silky, and they roll into a nice uniform ball without any ragged tears or large rough areas on the dough. To save you time, I'm not going to make you watch me do that for 10 minutes. So you can see the highlights here. What we need to do is continually push away from the center and fold back in. When we're kneading, we want to keep our downward surface down. That lets us build tension across the bottom of the bread. I am going to be dividing this later, but it's still good practice to knead with that in mind. So outwards, fold back to the middle, keeping the downward facing side down. Once you get there, pull in the outside edges, tuck them into a tight little ball, and you can roll it on the table to finish that off. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just forming up that ball, adding a bit more tension, stretching, pulling, stretching, and working the dough in such a way that that point where the things are held together is sort of centered underneath the very center of the top of the dough ball. Once you've done that, give it a roll, make sure that it's nicely held together. At that point, the kneading's done, so we're going to let it rest. What I was mentioning before is that we keep that top side facing up at this point. We're going to work the dough once more when we separate it. That means when we turn it out, we want the side that was down to be down once again. Take it away, give it 90 minutes to 2 hours to prove, and bring it back to the table when you're ready to separate it into balls to make your buns. Every time that I take the bread away from the table, I take the opportunity to get things clean, but now that we've brought it back proved, it's time to check with the poke test if we're ready to move on. If it is ready, the indentation will remain. If it's not ready, the dough will spring back to its original shape quite aggressively. It's not quite as springy with an enriched dough, but we can see here that the depressions are staying and the bread has increased considerably in size. It's time that we can safely move on. To separate dough, I always form a log. It makes it easier for me to visualize an even cut, so that's what I'm doing here. Working from the center, I'll separate the dough in two, and then I'll separate each of these halves twice more to give us 6 buns, half a dozen buns that we'll be putting in the oven. So as you can see here, eyeballing, but with a decent amount of accuracy. If you were very worried, at this stage you could measure out to get exactly even buns, but I think doing it by eye is a good skill to have if you're working in a hurry, and B, good enough for our purposes. You know, no one's going to be too upset if their bun is 1% or 2% smaller than the next person at the table. You can see as well, another good sign as we separate here is that there's little air bubbles and pockets forming in the dough. That means it's proving properly. If at this stage it was still very putty-like and uniform and there was no sign of carbon dioxide bubbles forming within your dough, that probably means it hasn't proofed enough. Maybe your space isn't warm enough or the yeast isn't active enough. Give it a little bit longer, just leave it as it is to keep fermenting and come back later once it's had a chance to bubble up. Unfortunately, as I've done before, I've done a wonderful job here of blocking your view using my big old head. What we're doing is shaping our buns at this stage, and we do that in the same way that we shaped that larger ball earlier. We take a bit from the side, pull it out, push it towards the centre, do that until we've gone right round the bun, flip it over and drag it across the surface of the table to build tension. Once we've done that, we need to get it ready for its final rise. I do this by putting baking paper on top of a chopping board, but any flat surface will allow you to slide that baking paper sheet into a preheated oven onto a preheated pan. Cover them up, give them another hour or so to prove. They'll increase considerably in size once again. From here, all we need to do is glaze them, seed them, and get them in the oven. So I'm using an egg glaze with a bit of water. It's probably around 50-50 water and egg. I used 1 egg to around 75 millilitres of water. I coat my buns, making sure to get right down to the bottom. We're on a non-stick sheet. If you trust your paper to be non-stick, you can glaze in this way, and I would advise that you do. I don't particularly like the look of bread that has a glaze on the top and then becomes drier towards the base, so I like to make sure and get glaze right down to the bottom if I can. Topping off with sesame seeds, I've taken a step here that's probably unnecessary for the recipe and soaked those sesame seeds. It actually made them harder to handle. Some seeds burn when they're used as a topping on bread, and the way around that is to do what I've done here and soak the seeds for a little bit in water before you put them on. That will give them more moisture, they'll steam rather than burning in the oven, and it will protect them. But because these are only getting a short bake as buns, and because sesame seeds are a bit more resistant to that burning, you probably don't need to do it, and a sprinkle on top of your egg would be fine. Once the seeds are on, I just finish the buns with a little bit more egg glaze. That shine is really important, and I think the glaze, in the same way as the water, offers just a little bit of protection to the sesame seeds. It helps to keep them nice and white against that golden brown that we'll get from the bread, and that's really pleasing visually on the final product. Chuck them in the oven for 25 minutes at around 200 degrees Celsius, and you'll end up with something like this. Firm enough to hold a burger and all the juices and toppings, but fluffy and light, kind of like a brioche. Absolutely perfect for burger buns. Fire the grill up, toast these off, and enjoy.